The collapse of the World Trade Center in New York in a terrorist strike shook the world. But the tragedy continues to claim victims almost 18 months on. 3/4 of the people exposed to the hazardous dust and debris at Ground Zero are now suffering from serious respiratory problems. Most of the scrap metal from the Twin Towers was shipped to Asia for recycling. And environmentalists are now demanding that the US reveal if workers here could also be exposed to the same health risks. Susan Yu reports on the growing problem of toxic waste dumping in Asia.
When the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center collapsed, they left more than 1.5 billion tons of debris. Nearly a quarter of that waste, mainly structural steel scrap, was sold to recyclers in Asia for between $100 to $120 a ton. Environmentalists fear the worst, accusing the U.S. government of allowing contaminated materials to be disposed of in the region. They say the scrap steel likely contains cancer-causing agents such as asbestos, PCBs, and other toxins, something the U.S. government has never publicly acknowledged.
Reasons are very obvious because this is the most convenient and the cheapest way for the industrialized countries to dump their toxic waste without dealing with the waste. And it has revealed the problem of this environmental discrimination.
The U.S. government has committed $12 million to fund a medical screening program for a quarter of the 35,000 rescue workers and volunteers involved in the cleanup at Ground Zero and nearby landfills. Just last month, doctors released their preliminary findings. They say roughly 75% of those screened are suffering serious ear, nose, and throat problems. More than half have evidence of lung disease. Environmentalists in Asia believe that's confirmation that workers recycling the debris in China, Korea, Japan, India, and Malaysia are equally exposed to the same health problems. This recycling plant just outside the Malaysian capital Kuala Lumpur is just one of many handling World Trade Center debris. We tried to talk to some of the workers inside, but were told by company security that we had to get permission first. The company stated it didn't want any undue publicity about the shipments.
About 1/4 of the World Trade Center tower wreckage has ended up in Asia, in recycling factories like this one you see behind me. Traders hope to profit from the exceptionally high-quality steel that was used for the construction of the towers. But environmentalists fear a high price will be paid for that.
Laksamananan Anjan has been fighting for workers' rights for more than 20 years. The outspoken activist and environmentalist is worried about the health and safety of Malaysia's uneducated scrapyard workers. He wants local and foreign governments to be accountable.
But the expert not come forward to help to us. So there are a lot of issues, lot of a company violating the law, but there is no background for us, you see.
Laksumanan Anjan's anger is shared by his counterparts elsewhere in the region. The scrap and waste trade is a dirty but wholly legal business. On paper, most governments in Asia are signatories to the Basel Convention, an international agreement banning the trans-country movement of hazardous waste. The United States is not a signatory of the Basel Convention, and that has Indian conservationists up in arms. More than 30,000 tons of the World Trade Center's scrap metal reached the country's shores without any certification the shipment was safe to handle. Citizen and green groups have launched an ongoing protest over the issue, alleging the Indian government's failure to protect workers.
The problem is always down to the level of local implementation. In the case of such a big country in China and India, it's always difficult to control this illegal waste import. So I would say both countries, the export countries and the import countries, has to bear the responsibility of controlling all this unethical waste trade to protect the people from the harms of these toxic substances.
In the U.S., the states are increasingly banning the dumping of this material in their local, city, and municipal landfills. And at the same time, the U.S. government is actually encouraging export through their policies of removing from their hazardous waste regulations anything that's going to be recycled. So basically, the word recycling has become a passport and a green light, ironically, for the export of this material to some of the most dirty recycling operations we've ever seen.
In China, recycling plants abound, along with cheap labor. As workers pick through more than 50 tons of World Trade Center scrap metal in Shanghai, hours away in Guiyu Township, conservationists say a tragedy is unfolding. Despite laws passed as recently as last August banning the import of hazardous electronic waste, the practice continues.
The labor costs alone in Asia are about $1 a day to process this kind of waste, as opposed to about $80 a day in North America.
Villagers, young and old, pick through and dismantle computer monitors and components from the United States. The electronic waste contains highly toxic and deadly materials. But more than 100,000 villagers make this their living, salvaging copper wires, leads, and other computer hardware as they breathe toxic fumes from the burning of worthless parts. It's hard to imagine that just 6 years ago, this community was a rice-growing town. Today, because of the recycling of electronic waste, the well water is too polluted to drink. Once fertile farmland is desecrated, and water now must be transported or pumped from another town 30 kilometers away.
It's the workers and community residents in these waste dismantling villages that are the immediate victims. And unfortunately, they are largely ignorant of the long-term impacts of this type of exposure. We saw the steady release of volatilized lead from the burning of circuit boards and desoldering operations. This is going to have a tremendous impact, particularly for future generations. There's genetic damage that is going to be done, which will be born in birth defects and impairment in the children's health down many generations. This is our real concern.
The situation has been an embarrassment to China, and in September, it made a high-profile seizure of hundreds of container loads of electronic waste entering its ports. But attempts by authorities in Asia to try to stop the toxic waste trade appear likely to end in failure. By 2005, an estimated 350 million computers will become obsolete and will likely end up in Guiyu and other poor communities in Asia. And many believe the problem will only get worse.
For many years now, electronic manufacturers have been able to avoid responsibility and benefit greatly financially by dumping their very real pollution costs on the poor communities of Asia. This has to stop. Export has to be banned of hazardous waste. But more importantly, perhaps, we have to be requiring that manufacturers take full responsibility for the end of life of their products and be willing to take them back, to loop that responsibility back to the manufacturer.